The first grey light seeped through the tiny, uneven window of the stone bothy, so faint that it was hardly more than a shifting of the darkness into a softer shade. The air inside was cold and still, carrying the faint scent of damp wool and peat smoke that had settled overnight into the thatch and the earthen floor. You noticed the quiet that lay across the valley, a stillness that fell deeper than usual, because so many of the neighbouring crofts now stood empty, their hearths cold and their doors left ajar. The handloom occupied most of the room, its dark wooden frame sturdy and silent, the heddles and warp threads hanging in patient readiness for another day of work. A single bird called outside, a clear note that started and then stopped, leaving only the sound of a distant burn trickling down the hillside over stones worn smooth by time. You crossed the earthen floor slowly, your bare feet feeling the packed, cool soil that had been trodden firm by countless footsteps. At the hearth a few embers still glowed beneath a covering of ash, and you knelt down to coax a small flame from them, adding a pinch of dry bracken and blowing gently until a thin wisp of smoke rose and caught the glow. The kettle, a blackened iron pot with a worn handle, hung from a chain over the fire, and you filled it with water from the wooden pail that stood by the door, dipping the cup carefully so as not to spill. You added a few blocks of cut peat from the stack beside the hearth, arranging them so that they would catch in time, and watched the thin ribbon of smoke rise to the thatch, tracing a slow, meandering path before disappearing into the dark of the rafters. The tartan plaid you were weaving waited on the loom, its colours muted in the dimness, heather tones, soft mossy greens, and a quiet brown that came from the local lichens. The warp threads stretched tight from the warp beam at the back of the loom to the cloth beam at the front, each one passing through a tiny brass eyelet in a heddle and then between the teeth of the reed in the beater. You ran your fingers over those threads, checking the tension with a touch that was slow and practiced, feeling for any loose strands or unevenness. The threads hummed softly under your fingers, a faint thrum that spoke of the work already done and the work yet to come. Everything was as it should be. The loom was ready. Outside, the shape of the land was still half hidden by the early light. You could see the gentle slope of the hill rising behind the bothy, covered in heather and coarse grass, and the line of the old track that led down past the cottages. Those cottages, once whitewashed and snug, were now dark shells, their roofs taken and their walls beginning to settle back into the hillside. Ferns and sorrel had already started to grow in the doorways, and patches of nettle marked where kitchen gardens used to be. The change had come not as a sudden event, but as a slow emptying, a quiet ebbing away of voices and the sound of children playing, leaving only the wind and the water and the call of the curlew. You noticed these things without distress, seeing them as you would see the changing of the seasons, a turn in the way the valley held its life. You turned back to the bothy, where the fire was beginning to give off a small, steady heat. The light from the window had crept further across the room, now touching the corner of the loom and picking out the fine dust that hung in the air, tiny specks of wool and peat ash suspended in a slow drift. The only other furnishings were simple: a wooden bench before the loom, a three-legged stool by the fire, a shelf chiseled into the stone wall holding a worn Bible and a horn spoon, and a few bundles of dyed wool stacked in a corner. The spinning wheel sat idle, its drive band slack, waiting to be used again when more yarn was needed. A small bunch of dried heather hung over the door, put there long ago and left as a quiet custom. You sat down on the bench, feeling the familiar smoothness of the wood under your hands as you settled into place. The shuttle lay on the beam beside you, a slender boat-shaped piece of yew, darkened by the oil of your fingers over many months. You picked it up and held it without moving, the weight of it a known comfort. The warp threads opened before you in a long, narrow shed, the path where the shuttle would pass, and you could see the pattern of the tartan emerging from the crossing of the coloured threads, a wide band of green, a narrow stripe of dark brown, then a fine line of pale blue that mirrored the distant lock. The next pass would add a single weft thread of green, and you paused before making it, letting the stillness of the morning settle around you like a cloak. The fire crackled softly, a single pop of expanding peat, and then fell silent again. The light through the window, now a soft watery grey, had brightened just enough to reveal the texture of the stone walls, each rock fitted against the next with earth and moss packed into the gaps to keep out the wind. The roof, a layer of turf over a frame of driftwood and alder branches, held the warmth close, and the thin thatch of heather and bracken rustled faintly in the slight breeze that moved outside. It was a shelter made from the land itself, shaped by hands that understood every stone and every hollow of the hill. Inside, the quiet had a layered quality, made up of the low hiss of the fire, the faint trickle of the burn, and the whisper of your own breathing. No other sound intruded. The empty valley offered a deep, protective silence that wrapped around the bothy like another layer of thatch. You looked down at the warp, each thread a line of potential color running from the back of the loom to the front, disappearing into the already woven cloth rolled onto the breast beam. The woven section was about a yard long now, its pattern clear and regular, the selvages straight and true. You had set up the warp weeks ago, measuring each thread on the warping mill under the grey sky of a late autumn day, counting with a careful chant under your breath. The memory of that work was quiet and pleasant. The turning of the mill, the smooth glide of the yarn through your fingers, the slow accumulation of the lengths of thread wound around the pegs. After that came the threading of the heddles. Each warp end passed through its own eyelet in a long, patient sequence, a task that filled a full day from dawn to dusk. And then the slaying of the reed, pulling groups of threads through the metal teeth, tapping them into place with a small hook. All that preparation was now gathered into this moment, the loom set and ready, asking only for the rhythm of the shuttle to draw the pattern into being. You touched the beater bar, the heavy wooden frame that swung forward to push each weft thread against the fell of the cloth. Its motion was a gentle pendulous swing, and you gave it a slight push, feeling the balanced weight, the way it returned to its resting place with a soft thud. The wood was smooth where your hands gripped it, polished by the grease of wool and the constant rubbing of the work. The reed within it, a close-set row of metal teeth like a fine-toothed comb, held the warp threads precisely spaced, ensuring that the fabric would be even and dense enough to keep out the Highland wind and rain. Everything was built for a slow, deliberate purpose, and the loom, with all its parts, was a companion in the quiet work of the days. The peat in the fire settled with a soft sigh, sending a small shower of sparks up toward the smoke hole in the roof. You watched them rise and vanish, then turned back to the wool. The yarn you were using for the weft had been spun during the long winter evenings, the spinning wheel humming as you fed the rolags of carded wool into the twist. The wool itself was from the hill sheep that grazed the rough pasture above the bothy, animals with thick, oily fleeces that shrubbed off the rain and caught the scent of heather. Shearing them had been a slow job, done with iron shears that clicked and snipped through the thick wool while the sheep lay quiet under your hands. After shearing came the washing in the burn, the wool spread out on the grass to dry, then the carding with flat paddles studded with wire teeth, pulling the fibers until they were airy and aligned. Spinning had turned those soft clouds into strong elastic yarn, and dyeing had given it the colors of the land. The green came from nettles and the roots of wild iris, boiled in the iron pot with a handful of alum brought by the travelling packman. The brown came from crotal, a lichen scraped from the rocks on the high moor, simmered until the water turned a rich, earthy russet, and the yarn took the colour as if remembering the stone it came from. The pale blue came from a small amount of indigo traded for a fleece at the last fair in the strath, stretched thin to colour just a few skeins with the fine stripes. Each thread held the story of its making, but none of that was spoken aloud. It was simply there, woven into the cloth, along with the hours of quiet labour. You lifted the shuttle and rested it on the warp, just at the edge of the shed. The thread trailed from the wound quill inside the shuttle, a single strand of deep heather green. You could feel the slight tension in the warp as the shed opened, the harnesses having been raised by the treadles the previous evening and left in place. The treadles themselves, two wooden pedals worn smooth, were connected by cords to the heddle harnesses above, and pressing them in sequence would lift and lower the warp threads to create the pattern. The sequence for this part of the tartan was simple, a regular alternation that produced the ground colour, a long stretch of solid green before the next stripe would be called for. You thought about the counting that would come later, the silent tally of weft shots that marked the width of each stripe, but for now there was only this first pick. Outside, the light was growing slowly. the grey becoming infused with a faint, pearly gold as the sun climbed behind the clouds. The shadows in the bothy softened, and the colours of the plaid, muted just minutes ago, now showed their full beauty, the green deepening to the shade of wet moss, the brown warming to the hue of rich earth, the blue stripe quickening like a sliver of sky reflected in a puddle. The light reached your hands and you saw the faint calluses on your fingers, the slight staining from the dye that would not wash out, the small nicks and scratches that came from handling fleece and carding teeth. These were the marks of the work, quiet and unremarkable, part of the texture of your life in the bothy. You took a slow breath, feeling the cool air fill your lungs, smelling the peat and the wool and the clean, bright scent of the morning coming through the gap under the door. The silence was complete now, not even the bird calling, just the steady trickle of the burn and the sound of your own heart beating in a calm, even rhythm. The valley lay beyond the door, empty and peaceful, its history held in the stones and the streams and the wind. The cottages that had been home to neighbours you knew were part of that history now, their stories closing into the ground like the turning of a page that no one would read aloud. But here in the bothy, the loom still held its warp, the shuttle still waited, and the pattern of the tartan, unchanged for generations, stood ready to continue. You sat there for a long moment, the shuttle in your hand, your feet resting lightly on the treadles. The bench was worn to a comfortable shape, the wood hollowed just where you always sat. The warp threads gleamed softly in the growing light, their hundreds of parallel lines a quiet order. The shuttle felt cool and solid, its pointed ends designed to pass smoothly through the shed without catching. The moment of starting was always like this, a pause that was not hesitation but a gathering of attention, a settling into the rhythm that would carry you through the hours ahead. Time in the bothy was not marked by clocks, but by the passage of the shuttle, the turning of the cloth beam, the slow shift of the light across the floor. You waited, feeling no hurry, letting the stillness hold you a little longer, before you would push the shuttle through the shed and begin, once again, the quiet work of weaving. The shuttle slid from your right hand into the shed, a smooth, oiled motion that parted the warp threads without resistance, and your left hand caught it gently at the other side, the movement already preparing to reverse. Your fingers, long accustomed to the shape and weight of the yew-wood, curled around it without thought, and you drew it back through the new shed that your feet had opened by pressing the treadle, the harnesses lifting and lowering the alternate set of warp threads in a quiet, mechanical dance. The beater bar came forward with a soft thud, pressing the weft thread against the already woven cloth, and then you let it swing back to its resting position while the treadles shifted again under the balls of your feet, changing the pattern in a sequence as natural as breathing. This was the rhythm of the shuttle, a steady, full-part beat that filled the bothy, the click of the treadle, the whisper of the shuttle passing, the gentle thump of the batten, and the small pause as your hands reset for the next pass. You repeated the motion, and the loom responded as it always did, with a kind of patient cooperation that made the work feel less like labor and more like a quiet conversation. The warp threads, hundreds of individual strands of dyed wool, rose and fell in groups, creating a triangular opening through which the shuttle could travel. Each time the shed changed, a new set of threads lifted while the others lowered, crossing the weft thread into the fabric in a plain weave that would, over many rows, accumulate into the solid green ground of the tartan. Your feet on the treadles found the rhythm without conscious direction, the right foot pressing first, then the left, then the right again, a slow walking cadence that matched the pace of your heart. The treadles themselves, smooth wooden paddles connected by hempen cords to the harnesses above, creaked softly with each depression, a sound that had become so familiar it was indistinguishable from the silence. The shuttle moved back and forth, and the weft thread paid out from the quill inside it with a faint, even tension. The quill was a small spool of paper or hollowed elder wood, wound tight with the heather-green yarn you had spun during the winter, and as it emptied, you would pause to wind a new one, a task that was part of the rhythm in its own way. But for now the quill was full, and the shuttle passed cleanly from hand to hand, the thread making a barely audible hiss as it cut through the air of the shed. Your hands knew the precise width of the shuttle's arc, the exact point at which to release and catch, never fumbling, never hurrying. The motion was as old as the loom itself, a pattern handed down through generations of weavers in this valley, each one adding their own small refinement to the way the shuttle was held, the way the beater was swung. You had learned it as a child, standing beside the loom and watching, then sitting on the bench with your feet barely reaching the treadles, and over the years it had become second nature. The beater bar propelled the reed against the fell of the cloth with a gentle, pendulous force. The reed was a close-set comb of split metal teeth, each one a tiny polished blade that guided a group of warp threads, and when it pressed the weft forward, it packed the threads together so tightly that the fabric became dense and weatherproof. The thump of the batten was not loud. It was a low, cushioned sound, absorbed by the wool in the wood, more felt than heard. After the thump, the beater swung back, and there was a brief interval of quiet before the treadles creaked again and the shed reversed. That interval was not empty. It was filled with your attention to the selved edge, the edge of the cloth where the weft turned and returned. You kept your gaze on the left-hand selved edge especially, because the shuttle entered on the right, and so the tension could sometimes pull the edge inward if you were not careful. A tiny smooth stone from the burn, no larger than a thumb, hung from the outer warp thread as a weight, its gentle pull keeping the thread straight and the selved edge perfectly vertical. Every few passes, you reached over to adjust the stone by a finger's breadth, a movement so small it hardly interrupted the flow. The tartan pattern grew line by line, each pick of the weft adding no more than the thickness of a single thread to the cloth. The green ground required many rows before the next stripe, and you counted them silently in your head, a slow tally that you kept without effort. After 60 picks, a narrow brown stripe would appear when you changed the weft thread to the dark russet yarn wound on a separate quill. That stripe would be 2 picks wide, then back to green for another long stretch. The counting was a kind of chant, numbers that rose and fell in your mind like the sound of the burn outside, each number a small marker in the vast, unhurried expanse of the day. You did not rush to reach the stripe. The stripe would come when the counting was done, and the counting was as much a part of the weaving as the shuttle itself. As you worked, the sound of the loom blended with the other quiet noises of the bothy, the low crackle of the peat fire, the faint trickle of the burn through the open door, the occasional whisper of wind across the thatch. These sounds layered together into a single, continuous background, a soft drone that the loom's rhythm punctuated without disrupting. The peat fire had burned down to a bed of glowing embers, and you paused once to add another block of peat, setting the shuttle down on the beam while you did so. The fire flared briefly with the new fuel, then settled, and you returned to the bench, your hands finding the shuttle without needing to look. The continuity of the work was not broken by such small interruptions. It flowed around them like water around a stone, adapting and continuing. The light from the small window shifted almost imperceptibly across the loom, the beam of pale sun moving so slowly that you never saw it change, only noticed after a long while that the shadows had shortened or lengthened. Dust motes floated in that beam, tiny fragments of wool and peat ash and dried heather, drifting in lazy, unpredictable paths through the still air. They sparkled faintly when they caught the light, a quiet, private show that no one else would see because the valley was empty. The bothy, with its thick stone walls and deep thatch, held the air almost motionless, so that the dust took a long time to settle. Sometimes a mote would drift onto the warp threads and cling there, and you would brush it away with a light puff of breath, watching it rejoin the slow dance. The world outside the window was a muted painting of grey-green hill and silver sky, a landscape so constant that it seemed to hold its breath along with you. Your mind, free of any need to direct your hands, drifted to the sheep whose wool this was. You remembered their faces, each one distinct, and the way they would lift their heads from grazing when you approached across the hill, their eyes calm and curious. The ewe with the black spot on her left ear, the one that always led the flock to the high shieling in summer. Her fleece had been particularly thick and oily, perfect for the outer layer of the plaid. The old ram, who had his own place by the crag, had given wool that was coarser and that had gone into the warp threads for strength. As you wove, your fingers felt the character of each fleece in the texture of the yarn, the slight variations in crimp and softness that told a story of high pasture and heather, of snow on the hill and the warm sun of midsummers when the lambs grew fast. These memories were not sharp or distinct. They surfaced and faded like the shadows in the room, with no urgency or demand. After a long stretch of green, the count in your head reached the number for the brown stripe. You set down the green shuttle and picked up the one wound with the dark russet yarn, the transition so fluid that the cloth would show no sign of the change except the shift in color. The brown shuttle felt slightly lighter, the quill inside wound more loosely, and you adjusted your grip accordingly without conscious thought. The first brown pick passed through the shed, a fine dark line against the green, and the beater pressed it home. The second pick followed, identical, and then you exchanged shuttles again, returning to the green. The stripe appeared as a clean, narrow band, perfectly straight, a quiet punctuation in the broad expanse of green. You looked at it for a moment, checking its alignment with the stripe below, making sure the set was precise. The pattern was built on such precise repetitions, each stripe a mirror of the one that came before, and your eye was trained to catch any deviation. There was none. The stripe sat in its proper place, and the green resumed. The self-gauge continued to grow, a neat, firm edge that would withstand years of wear. You checked it frequently, not with anxiety, but with the same patient attention you gave to every part of the cloth. The small stone weight on the left side swung gently with the motion of the loom, a tiny pendulum that kept the outer thread under constant, gentle tension. On the right side, the shuttle entered and exited cleanly, leaving a loop that you adjusted with a slight tug of your fingers every few passes so that it lay flat and did not pull. The cloth's beam, a thick wooden roller at the front of the loom, turned almost imperceptibly as the woven fabric accumulated, the ratchet and pawl mechanism clicking once every quarter-inch of progress. That click was the slowest sound in the bothy, a single low note that marked the passing of a larger increment of work, and you heard it perhaps twice in an hour. Time in the weaving was measured by the number of weft threads added. Each pick was a unit of time, and the day was made of thousands of them. You had no clock, no sundial. The light and the count were enough. The light from the window, now a cooler, brighter grey, told you that the morning was advancing, and the ache in your shoulders, a mild, familiar tightness, told you that you had been sitting for a long while. You paused to roll your shoulders and flex your fingers, feeling the joints pop softly, then resumed, the rhythm picking up seamlessly where it had left off. The bench beneath you was hollowed by your weight, a comfortable dip that cradled you in the right position. You could have sat there for hours more, and you would. The quiet outside the bothy was so deep that it seemed to press inward, a vast, gentle pressure that made the small space of the loom feel like the center of the world. No voices carried on the wind, no dogs barked, no children laughed. The cottages down the track were silent, their roofless walls open to the sky. You had seen them when you walked to the well that morning, and you had noted the fresh grass growing where kitchen floors used to be, but the sight had not troubled your weaving. The weaving was its own world, a world of thread and wood and rhythm, and it continued regardless of who stayed or left. The tartan pattern was a constant, a language that did not change with the fortunes of the valley. It was woven into the history of the place, and as long as the loom stood, the pattern would be made. The dust motes drifted, and the fire breathed. You changed shuttles again for another brown stripe, this time on the other side of the green band, to complete the set symmetry. The stripe appeared, 2 picks of russet, then green again. The counting in your head reset to 1, and you began the long stretch anew. The pattern was now building into a full repeat, a wide field of green bounded by narrow brown stripes, and soon after many more picks, a fine pale blue line would bisect the green, a thread of sky between the earth and the heather. That blue stripe would be only a single pick, a delicate flash of color, and it required a third shuttle, the one wound with the indigo-dyed yarn. You kept that shuttle on the beam beside the brown one, waiting, and when the count reached its place, you would pick it up, pass it once, and set it down again, the whole operation taking no more than a few beats of the rhythm. The blue stripe came, and you wove it in, the pale thread shining for a moment before the beater pressed it into the cloth where it would remain, a permanent part of the pattern. Then back to green, the brown again, and so the set repeated over and over, each repeat identical to the last, each one a small, complete act of making. The cumulative effect was a fabric of deep, quiet beauty, a plaid that would serve as a garment, a blanket, a shelter. It held the warmth of the wool, the colors of the hillside, and the hours of patient work. And as the shuttle continued its steady flight, the sound of the loom became a lullaby that the bothy sang to itself, a song with no beginning and no end, only the gentle ongoing pulse of the weft crossing the warp under your hands. The rhythm of the shuttle continued, a steady back and forth that your hands maintained without any demand on your thoughts, leaving your mind free to wander back through the long journey that each thread had taken before it reached the loom. The warp and weft crossing under your fingers were not just yarn. They were the end of a slow process that stretched across the seasons, from the high hill grazing to the simmering dye pot, from the sheep's back to the spinning wheel that now stood silent in the corner. As the shuttle passed through the shed and the beater pressed the weft into place, your memory drifted like the dust in the window light, touching quietly on the many hours of preparation that had filled this bothy with the scent of wool and heather and simmering lichen. The wool itself had come from the hill sheep that you knew by name and by face, a small flock of black-face ewes and one old ram whose fleece was coarser but strong. Shearing them had been a careful, unhurried task, carried out on a mild day in early summer when the last of the snow had melted from the high corries and the grass was growing thick. You recalled the weight of the ewe against your knees as you sat on the turf outside the bothy, the iron shears cool in your hand, the blades opening and closing with a steady rasp. The sheep lay quiet after the first few strokes, the thick fleece parting from the skin in one continuous sheet that rolled back like a heavy blanket being folded away. The smell of lanolin rose around you, a rich, greasy sweetness that clung to your fingers and made them slide easily through the wool. When the shearing was done, the fleece was rolled and tied with a strand of its own yarn, a tight bundle that still held the warmth of the animal's body and the faint, wild scent of the heather where she had slept. You remembered carrying the fleeces down to the burn on a morning when the sky was a pale, even grey and the water ran cold and clear over stones of every size. Washing the wool was a matter of patience, of submerging each fleece in a pool where the current was gentle and letting the cold water do its slow work. You held the wool under a flat stone so it would not drift away, and you watched the lanolin loosen and cloud the water with a milky film that the stream carried off downstream until the fleece was clean and bright. The washing took hours, and you sat on the bank between fleeces, your bare feet in the cold water, listening to the burn's constant murmur and the occasional bleat of a ewe calling her lamb on the far slope. When the wool was clean, you lifted it out heavy with water and spread it across the heather to dry, the white and grey and brown fibers catching the light while the wind moved through them with a soft rustle. The heather itself, a low carpet of purple and green, cradled the wool and lent it the first hint of the moorland scent that would never quite wash out. After drying came the carding, a task that you performed by the fire on many evenings with the door open to the last of the daylight. The carders were a pair of flat wooden paddles, their backs worn smooth by years of gripping, their faces studded with rows of fine wire teeth that caught the wool and pulled its fibers into alignment. You took a handful of the clean fleece and drew one carder through the other, a gentle scraping motion that teased out the tangles and mixed the long and short fibers until the wool became a soft, airy cloud. The sound of carding was a whisper, a repetitive hush-hush that blended with the crackle of the peat and the low hum of the spinning wheel when it was in use. After a few passes, you rolled the carded wool from the teeth with a deft twist of your wrist, creating a loose cylinder called a rolag, light and fluffy, ready for the spindle. The rolags accumulated in a willow basket beside the hearth, a growing pile of soft potential that smelled of clean fleece and faintly of the heather it had dried on. The spinning wheel in the corner, now silent, came vividly to your mind as you recalled the long hours of turning those rolags into yarn. The wheel was made of dark, well-seasoned alder wood, its drive wheel a large circle with 8 turned spokes that blurred into a single disc when it spun. The leather drive belt looped from the wheel to the small whorl of the spindle, and when you pressed the treadle with your foot, the whole mechanism came to life with a rhythmic hum. The treadle itself, a worn wooden pedal, had developed a squeak that you had silenced by rubbing a bit of mutton fat into its hinge, and after that, The only sound was the low, steady whir of the wheel and the soft creak of the distaff as the wool fed into the twist. You sat on the three-legged stool with a basket of rolags on one side and the growing spindle of yarn on the other, your fingers pinching and releasing the wool, drawing it out into a fine, even strand while the spindle added twist. The motion was as practiced as the weaving, a dance of foot and hand that required just enough attention to keep the thread from becoming too thin or too thick, but not so much that your mind could not drift. You spun through the autumn evenings while the wind rattled the thatch, and through the deep winter nights when the snow pressed against the door, the wheels hum, a steady companion in the lamplight. The yarn gathered on the spindle, a neat cone of twisted wool that would later be wound into skeins, washed to set the twist, and finally dyed to the colors of the tartan. Dyeing the yarn was a quieter, more patient chemistry, carried out in the iron pot over the fire, using plants and lichens gathered from the hill and the strath. The deep green of the tartan's ground came from nettles and wild iris roots, both collected in late summer when their colors were strongest. You remembered pulling the tall nettles with gloved hands, their leaves leaving a familiar sting that faded quickly, and digging the iris roots from the damp soil beside the burn with a wooden trowel. The nettles and roots were chopped roughly and boiled together in the iron kettle, the water turning a murky brown-green that smelled of earth and boiled greens. A piece of alum from the packman's store, a crystalline lump as clear as ice, was added to fix the color to the wool, and then the skeins of cream-colored yarn were lowered into the simmering bath. You stirred them with a smooth stick of hazel, watching the yarn darken slowly as it absorbed the dye over the course of an afternoon. The color that emerged was not a single flat green, but a subtle shifting shade that held hints of the yellow iris hearts and the deep blue-green of the nettle leaves, a color that looked different in sunlight and shadow, much like the hillside itself. The russet brown of the narrow stripes came from crotal, a lichen that grew in crusty, overlapping circles on the exposed rocks above the bothy. Gathering crottle was a slow, methodical work done on a dry day when the lichen was brittle and easy to scrape off with a flat piece of horn. You would climb to the high outcrops with a canvas bag, the wind strong and clean, and you would work your way over the lichened boulders, the scrape of the horn against the stone, the only sound apart from the wind. The crottle was a pale, dusty grey when dry, but when you simmered it in water it released a deep, rusty orange that darkened to a rich brown as the yarn steeped. The dye pot gave off a strange, sharp scent like old wood and damp stone, a smell that lingered in the bothy for days and wove itself into the fabric of the place. Each skein of brown yarn held the memory of the high rocks and the gale that had whipped your hair while you scraped, and later, when you handled it at the loom, you could almost feel the cold of that wind. The pale blue stripe, a single fine thread that cut through the green, was the color of a distant loch under a clouded sky, and it came from indigo that you had traded for at the last fair. Indigo was rare and precious, a dark blue powder wrapped in a twist of paper, and you had used it sparingly, dyeing only a few small skeins in a simmering vat that required constant attention. The indigo vat was different from the others. It needed to be kept warm but not boiling, and the yarn had to be dipped and then exposed to the air for the color to develop. You had lifted the skeins out of the vat, a pale greenish yellow, and then watched as the air turned them slowly blue, deepening with each dip until they reached the soft, watery shade you wanted. That little bundle of blue yarn now sat by the loom, and each time you wove its single pick into the tartan, you thought of the fair day, the bustle of the market, and the long walk home with the indigo paper tucked safely in your pocket. All these processes had filled the bothy with a quiet chain of scents: the earthy green of the nettle dye, the sharp tang of the crotal, the clean wool smell of freshly carded fleece, and the faint metallic note of the alum. The rafters overhead still held bunches of dried herbs and the dark stains of smoke, and the air itself seemed to hold the memory of those days of preparation, each scent layered on the last like the colors of the plaid on the loom. When you sat on the bench and wove, the yarn passed through your fingers carrying those scents, faint but unmistakable, and they brought back the feeling of the cold burn water on your hands, the weight of the shears, the hum of the spinning wheel, and the long, quiet hours beside the dye pot. The connection between the landscape and the cloth was complete and unbroken. The green of the nettle mirrored the grass that grew on the lower slopes. The brown of the crotal was the exact shade of the winter heath when the heather had died back. The blue recalled the loch and the sky after rain. Every thread was a direct translation of the hill into yarn, and as you wove, you were not inventing a pattern, but recording the place itself in a language of colour and line. The valley might be emptying, the crofts falling silent one by one, but the wool held its quiet history without change. The sheep still grazed the high pasture, the burn still ran, the lichen still grew on the rocks. The plaid, when it was finished, would carry all of this with it, a piece of the land that could be folded and worn, a shelter woven from the very substance of the Highlands. The shuttle passed through the shed again, a weft of heather green drawn from the quill, and your hands continued their work while your mind drifted back from the memories. The present moment of the weaving was itself part of the same long process, the final act in a sequence that began with the shearing under the summer sun and would end when the last inch of the plaid was cut from the loom. The quiet of the bothy enfolded all these memories, holding them gently, and the loom's rhythm, steady and slow, tied them together into a single, seamless fabric of time. The bothy had stood on this slope for longer than any living memory could trace, its walls built of undressed stone gathered from the hillside, each rock chosen for its flat face and carried up or down the slope with only the strength of arms and a woven creel. The stones were fitted together without mortar, their shapes dictating the joints, and into the gaps the builders had packed dark earth mixed with dried moss to seal the crevices against the wind that scoured the glen in winter. Over the years, the moss had continued to grow in the damp of the walls, tiny green cushions that softened the grey stone and gave the bothy the appearance of something that had risen naturally from the ground, a part of the hill rather than a structure placed upon it. The stones were cool to the touch, holding the chill of the night even in the afternoon, and they sweated faintly when the fire was lit, a fine sheen of moisture that caught the light and glistened for a moment before drying into the air. The roof was a thick layer of turf cut from the moor, its grass side facing upward so that it continued to grow, sending pale roots through the dark earth into the framework below. That framework was a lattice of driftwood, gathered from the shore of the sea loch, silvery and salt-worn, lashed together with hempen rope and supplemented with crooked alder branches cut from the copse by the burn. The alder had a reddish tint and a smooth bark that had darkened with age and smoke, and the joints of the rafters were pegged with wooden dowels, not a single iron nail in the whole structure. Over the turf, a thin thatch of heather and bracken had been tied down with more rope, the ends weighted with rounded stones to keep the whole covering from lifting in the gales. The thatch was a patchwork of purples and browns and rusted greens, the heather stems interlaced with the softer bracken fronds, and in the rain it smelled of the moor, that deep, peaty aroma that settled into the bothy and stayed there. Inside, the floor was the same earth that lay outside, packed hard by the tread of feet, until it was nearly as firm as stone, its surface smoothed and swept each morning with a bundle of heather twigs. A layer of fine dust, the leavings of wool and peat ash, covered it in a thin, soft carpet that puffed up around your heels when you walked. The centre of the bothy was open to the roof, and there the peat fire glowed on a flat hearthstone, its smoke drifting up slowly through the space, weaving its way through the rafters until it found the small opening left in the thatch. That opening was not a proper chimney, but a gap adjusted by a flat stone that could be shifted to regulate the draw, and the smoke took its time leaving, lingering in the upper reaches of the bothy and coating the timbers with a dark, glossy patina that shone dully in the firelight. This slow, continuous curing had preserved the wood and given the interior the scent of ancient smoke, a smell as layered as the soot itself. Your eyes, accustomed to the dimness, traced the few objects that shared the space with the loom. The iron pot hung from its chain over the fire, its bottom blackened with many meals, its handle worn thin at the grip where countless hands had lifted it from the flame. Beside the hearth sat a wooden bowl carved from a single piece of birch, its grain a concentric pattern of pale gold and darker brown, smoothed by years of use until the inside felt like polished stone under the touch of a horn spoon. The spoon itself, the colour of warm honey, rested in the bowl, its handle curved to fit the palm, its bowl hollowed patiently with a knife and rubbed with mutton fat until it gleamed. These were not things of value in any market, They were things that had been made here, from materials that the land had offered, and their worth was the simple worth of daily necessity. On a stone shelf chiseled into the wall, a shelf formed by removing one rock and flattening the one below, rested a Bible with a cracked leather cover. The leather was dark and stiff, its surface crazed with a network of fine lines like the map of a dried streambed, and the pages inside were yellowed and soft, some of them dog-eared from the habit of a reader long ago. The book had been carried to this valley by a grandmother whose name you still spoke when you lit the candle for the dead, and it held, pressed between its pages, a few dried wildflowers that crumbled to dust if touched. The shelf also held a small flat stone that served as a candle holder, a lump of beeswax from a wild hive stuck to it, the wick, a twisted strand of flax. The candle was seldom lit. The firelight in the window were usually enough, but it waited there in case of need. Over the door, a small bunch of dried heather hung from a peg, tied with a scrap of red thread that had faded to the color of old rust. The heather had been gathered on a day in late summer when the hills were purple with bloom, and it was hung there as a quiet gesture of hope for good fortune, a custom so old that no one remembered its origin, only that it was done. The bunch was dusty now. The tiny bells of the heather flowers closed and brittle, but it still held a faint, honeyed scent that the fire's warmth sometimes released into the air, a ghost of the summer hillside. You touched the doorpost each time you passed, not through any conscious ritual, but through the habit of a hand that had done so for years. The bothy absorbed all the sounds and scents that the weaving produced, holding them the way the wool itself held the warmth of a body. The wool dust that floated in the air, an invisible cloud of tiny fibers released by the carding and spinning and weaving, had settled on every surface over the seasons, a fine greasy film that softened the edges of the stones and gave the wood a silvery bloom. It gathered in the corners, mixed with the peat ash, and formed small drifts against the wall that shifted with the draught. The scent of lanolin, the natural oil of the wool, permeated everything, mingling with the smoke and the earthy smell of the turf roof, to create an atmosphere that was particular to this one room. The quiet hum of the loom, when it was in motion, vibrated through the floor and the bench, a low frequency that the bothy structure seemed to amplify and return, so that the whole building became part of the instrument that wove the plaid. From the bench, you could see the door standing slightly ajar, a gap just wide enough to let in fresh air without cooling the room. The door itself was a single slab of driftwood, heavy and grey, hung on leather hinges that creaked when the wind moved it, and the gap framed a narrow view of the path that led down to the empty crofts. The path was a ribbon of pale earth winding between clumps of heather and coarse grass, its surface marked by the tracks of carts that would not return. At the bottom of the slope, the roofless cottages stood in a row, their walls still waist-high in some places, collapsed in others, the stones already being reclaimed by sorrel and nettle and the slow creep of bracken. The doorways were dark rectangles against the grey sky, and the windows, empty of their wooden frames, let the light through without interruption. You could see where the kitchen gardens had been, their boundaries still faintly visible as lines of stones, now overgrown with thistles and the bright yellow of ragwort. You looked toward that view, not with sadness, but with a simple, quiet acceptance, the same acceptance you gave to the falling of the light or the turning of the seasons. The families who had lived in those cottages had left with their belongings loaded onto carts, their departure a slow procession that had taken place over many weeks while you wove. Some had gone to the coast to board ships bound for new lands across the sea. Others had walked south to the factory towns where the looms were iron and powered by water. Their voices had faded from the glen the way the smoke fades from the thatch, gradually and then entirely, leaving behind a silence that was not empty but full of a different quality. This new quiet was deeper, broader, a stillness that stretched from the hilltops to the loch without interruption, and it permitted the small sounds of the bothy to carry further than they ever had before. The click of the treadle, the thump of the batten, the rustle of the yarn. These tiny noises now travelled out through the open door and across the deserted slopes, the only sounds of human presence in the whole valley. The bothy, in the midst of this emptying, remained unchanged. Its walls, built from the same stone as the abandoned cottages, had no opinion on who stayed or went. They simply stood, holding the warmth of the fire and the rhythm of the loom. The turf roof continued to grow its grass. The heather thatch continued to shed the rain, and the little bunch of dried flowers over the door continued to crumble slowly, one tiny petal at a time. The objects inside, the pot and the bowl and the spoon and the book, were exactly where they had always been, arranged in the same careful order, their usefulness undiminished. The loom occupied the center of this quiet permanence, its wooden frame as much a part of the bothy as the walls themselves, and the pattern of the tartan growing on the cloth beam was the same pattern that had been woven here for generations, before the clearances began and long before the ships came to the coast. Now and then a draught moved through the door and stirred the ashes on the hearth, lifting a few flakes of white ash that twisted into the air before settling back onto the hearthstone. The smoke shifted with the draught, curling in a new direction, and the shadows on the walls swayed slightly. The rafters creaked once, a single low note, then fell silent again. These small movements were the only signs that the world outside the bothy still existed, and they were as gentle as the breathing of a sleeper. You were not alone in the bothy despite the emptiness of the valley. You were surrounded by the presence of all the work that had been done here, all the wool that had been carded and spun and woven into cloth that warmed bodies through the winters. The walls held that presence, as they held the scent of the dye pots and the sound of the old songs that had been hummed over the spinning wheel, an accumulation of quiet human life that the stones would not release. The light through the door shifted slowly, the bright rectangle on the earthen floor moving inch by inch as the sun climbed behind the clouds. It touched the edge of the loom, illuminating the row of heddles and the brass eyelets that gleamed like tiny stars, and then it moved on, leaving the loom in shadow again. You noticed these changes without interrupting the work. Your hands continued to pass the shuttle, your feet continued to press the treadles, and the cloth continued to grow, thread by thread. The bothy held you in the center of its stillness, and the valley, emptied of its people, lay around you like a great, silent bowl filled only with the sound of the burn and the wind and the steady, patient beat of the loom. The tartan had grown long enough on the cloth beam that the full pattern of the set was now clearly visible, a repeated sequence of colors and proportions that had emerged line by line from the patient crossing of warp and weft. You could see it best when you leaned back slightly from the bench, letting your eyes take in the whole width of the fabric from selvage to selvage. And there it was, the broad band of deep heather green, the paired narrow stripes of dark russet brown, and the single, slender line of pale indigo blue that cut through the center of the green like a thread of loch water under a clouded sky. The pattern repeated in perfect symmetry, a mirror image that folded out from the central blue stripe and then folded back again, so that the left side of the plaid was exactly the same as the right, and the whole design hung together with a balanced, restful harmony. The set was not a random arrangement of colors, but a precise counted sequence that had been passed down through memory, never written on paper, but held in the rhythm of the weaving itself. Each color had its own number of threads, and that number determined the width of its stripe. The green ground was the widest, spanning 60 ends of the warp, a number you held in your head without effort because it had been part of the weaving chant since your first lesson at the loom. After the 60 green threads came 2 threads of the dark brown, a stripe so narrow it was barely wider than a blade of grass, yet it stood out clearly against the green because the brown was deep and warm and rich. Then 2 more threads of green, a brief return to the ground color, and then the single thread of pale blue, the center line of the whole design. After the blue, the pattern reversed, 2 green, 2 brown, and then the long stretch of 60 green again, continuing until the next repeat began. This sequence of numbers, 62, 1, 2, 62, and 60, was recited so often in your mind that it had become a kind of silent music, a pattern of counting that matched the treadle changes and the passage of the shuttle. You had learned the set from your mother, who had learned it from her father, who had learned it from the old man who wove in this bothy before any of them were born. The knowledge was not taught in words, but absorbed through watching, through standing beside the loom as a child and seeing how the shuttle changed at the brown stripe, how the fingers reached for the blue shuttle only at the center line, how the feet on the treadles followed a pattern that was different for each part of the settee. Over time, the numbers sank into your memory until they were not something you recalled, but something you simply knew, the way you knew the path to the well or the sound of the burn. The tartan set was as much a part of the valley as the shape of the hills, an inheritance that did not diminish with the emptying of the crofts. As the pattern repeated on the cloth beam, its colours spoke of the landscape in a language that was quiet and direct. The green was the colour of the summer grazing. The wide slopes of rough grass and heather that rose from the valley floor, dotted with sheep and harebells and the occasional scatter of white stones where a burn crossed the turf. It deepened in the damp hollows where the moss grew thick and the water seeped through the peat, and it paled on the high ridges where the wind clipped the grass short and the sun bleached the blades to a silvery green. All these shades were held within the single heather green dye, which shifted subtly depending on how many times the yarn had been dipped and how strong the nettle decoction had been. The tartan green was not uniform. It had a living variation that made the fabric seem to move and breathe under different lights. The brown was the colour of the winter moor, the dark, bruised heather that covered the hills after the bloom had faded and the stems had turned to rusty wire. It was the colour of the peat banks, where the dark earth was cut in slabs and stacked to dry, each block marked with the parallel grooves of the cutting iron. It was the colour of the burn after heavy rain, when the water ran thick with the peat wash and frothed brown around the stones. The croltile lichen that had dyed this yarn grew on the same rocks where the peat water ran, and it had absorbed the essence of that dark tannin-rich soil, transferring it to the wool so that the brown stripe in the plaid carried the weight of the winter hillside. The pale blue was the colour of the distant loch, the long narrow sheet of water that lay at the foot of the glen and reflected the sky. On a still day, the loch was a pale milky blue, the colour of a sky after rain when the clouds were beginning to thin. On a grey day, it turned to slate, but the blue stripe in the tartan held only the palest version, the colour of the loch, seen from a distance on a morning when the mist was lifting. A single thread of this blue ran through the centre of every repeat, a quiet flash of brightness that drew the eye and gave the whole set its character. And when you wove it in, you thought of the loch and the way its surface moved under the wind, a constant, gentle motion like the breathing of the earth. The plaid you were weaving was destined to be a length of cloth, long enough to serve many purposes, a garment and a blanket and a shelter all in one. The traditional arrasade that had been worn in the Highlands since long before any outside eye had recorded the custom. When it was finished, it would measure many yards, enough to wrap around the body and pleat at the waist, to pull up over the head against the rain, to spread on the heather as a bed for a night under the stars. The tartan pattern would identify the wearer's connection to this valley and this clan, a visible sign of belonging that needed no words. Though the clan system was fading, its old structures of loyalty and kinship dissolving under the pressure of the clearances, the pattern on the loom remained unchanged, a quiet act of continuation that required no permission and sought no notice. Outside the bothy, the valley was a place of departure. The laird's factors had come with their papers and their notices, and the crofts had emptied one by one, the families choosing between the emigrant ships and the southern mills. Some weavers in the glen had dismantled their looms and taken them apart, loading the wooden beams onto carts or leaving them behind to weather into the turf. Their shuttles lay still, their heddles tangled, their warp threads cut and left to dangle in the empty cottages. But here, in this bothy, the loom was still warped, the shuffle still passed, and the tartan set still repeated its ancient sequence with every beat of the batten. The pattern did not know that the valley was emptying. It did not need to know. It was made of wool and dye and time, and it continued because your hands continued. The symmetry of the set brought a quiet satisfaction each time you saw it, the way the pattern balanced itself around its central blue line like the reflection of a hill in the still water of the loch. The left side mirrored the right. The broad green fields matched. The narrow brown pairs stood at equal distances, and the single blue thread was the pivot on which the whole design turned. This symmetry was not merely decorative, it was a structural principle that gave the cloth its integrity, ensuring that the plaid would hang evenly and fold neatly, that the weight would be distributed and the pattern would look the same from either side. The weave itself was a plain tabby, a simple over-under crossing, but the colour pattern elevated it into something more, a fabric that was both practical and full of quiet meaning. As you wove, the counting in your mind became a meditative recitation, a silent chant that aligned itself with the treadle changes and the shuffle passes. 60 green, 2 brown, 2 green, 1 blue, 2 green, 2 brown, and then the long green again. The numbers rose and fell like the contour of the hills, a landscape of their own that you traversed with each repeat of the set. There was no hurry in the counting, no pressure to reach the end of the pattern. The pattern had no end, only the continuation of the cloth until the warp was used up. Each repeat added another few inches to the length, and you watched the plaid grow with the same calm attention you gave to everything else, noting how the stripes aligned vertically as well as horizontally, the warp stripes meeting the weft stripes to form a grid of color intersections that shifted and changed as the fabric accumulated. The quiet of the bothy seemed to deepen with each repeat of the set, as if the pattern itself was weaving the silence into the cloth. The fire breathed, the wind moved over the thatch, the burn trickled on its ancient course, and the loom beat its steady rhythm, the only sound of human making in the whole valley. The tartan pattern, fixed in memory and thread, continued to appear under your hands, line by line, stripe by stripe, a piece of the old ways preserved in the simplest and most enduring of forms. The light through the open door had shifted from the pale grey of morning to a clearer, brighter shade that fell across the beaten earth floor in a slowly moving square of pale gold, its edges soft and blurred by the slight haze of peat smoke that hung in the air. This was the hour when the sun, hidden though it was behind a high veil of cloud, reached the gap in the hills that faced the bothy and sent its diffused glow down into the valley, marking the midpoint of the day without the need for any clock. You noticed the light on your hands as they worked the shuttle, the way it warmed the skin and picked out the fine lines of the calluses, and after a while, when the count of the set had completed another full repeat, you let the shuttle rest on the beam and straightened your back, feeling the gentle ache of the long sitting settle into your shoulders, and then slowly release. The loom was silent now, the heddles motionless, the warp threads holding their crossed pattern like a breath held. You stood up from the bench, your knees and ankles stiff but not painful, and the packed earth of the floor felt cool and solid under your bare feet after the warmth of the wooden footrest. The quiet of the bothy, which had been overlaid with the rhythm of the weaving, now became complete, a deep, full stillness that seemed to fill your ears with its own soft pressure. The fire gave a low crackle, a single peat block settling into the embers, and then the only sounds were the distant trickle of the burn and the whisper of the wind across the heather thatch. You stepped to the door and pulled it open a little wider, the leather hinges creaking in their familiar voice, and walked out onto the grass that grew right up to the threshold. The air outside was cool and fresh, carrying the clean smell of damp earth and the faint honeyed scent of the heather that had not yet bloomed but still held its fragrance in the green stems. The sky was a broad expanse of soft grey and silver, the clouds moving slowly from the west, their shadows trailing across the hillsides in patches of darker green and purple-brown. The valley lay before you in its unusual silence, a landscape that had once been busy with the small noises of many lives and was now quiet in a way that felt ancient, as if the land had returned to a condition it remembered from before the first stones were laid for the first croft. You stood there for a moment, letting your eyes travel across the familiar shapes. The outlines of the old rune-rig cultivation lines were still faintly visible on the lower slopes, a series of gentle ridges and furrows that ran parallel down to the burn, their pattern now softened by years of grass, but not yet erased. The narrow strips had once been planted with oats and barley, and in the lower, wetter ground with kale, and the families had worked them by hand with wooden ploughs and spades made of alder. Now the rigs were covered with coarse grass and scattered with the purple of thistles, the bright yellow of ragwort, and the flat dark green rosettes of sorrel that spread in the ditches. The stone enclosures that had marked the boundaries of each family's plot were still standing in places, low walls of gathered rock that wandered across the slope in meandering lines, but in other sections they had tumbled, the stones scattered by frost and the rooting of sheep. Further down, the cottages stood in their row, their walls catching the pale light and holding it dully. Some were almost intact up to their gables, their doorways dark and empty, while others had collapsed into heaps of stone that were already being covered over by bracken. The kitchen gardens that had once been planted with potatoes and herbs were now a tangle of nettles and coarse weeds, though here and there a stray plant of cabbage or a clump of chives had persisted, growing wild among the invaders. The sight of these abandoned homes was not jarring, it was simply the way things were now, a slow return of the human spaces to the larger quiet of the hill. The burn glinted as it followed its ancient course past the empty walls, a thread of moving light that wound through the valley floor and disappeared into a copse of alder and birch. The water's voice, a constant murmur on the edge of hearing, was the same voice it had always had, unchanged by any comings or goings. Above the burn, the hill rose in a long, steady slope, its lower reaches a patchwork of heather and grass, its middle dotted with the dark green of bracken beds, and its upper part fading into the grey of the cloud base where the rock outcrops stood like sentinels. A curlew called far off, its note thin and clear and melancholy, and then the silence closed back over it. You walked a short way to the well, following the narrow path that your own feet had worn into the turf over the seasons. The well was not a built structure but a natural spring that rose from a cleft in the rock, its water pooling in a small basin lined with flat stones that someone had placed there long ago. The water was always cold and clear, welling up from the deep places in the hill and spilling over the lowest stone in a tiny, constant trickle that joined the burn further down. A wooden bucket stood beside the spring, its staves dark with moisture, and you knelt to fill it, dipping it into the pool and watching the surface shatter into ripples that raced to the edges and then slowly settled back into stillness. The water was so clear that you could see every pebble and grain of sand on the bottom, the tiny bubbles of the spring rising through it like beads of glass. When the bucket was full, you lifted it with both hands, feeling the weight pull at your arms and shoulders, and carried it back to the bothy, the water sloshing gently against the wooden sides. Inside, you poured some into the iron kettle to replace what had steamed away during the morning, and you drank a cupful from the wooden bowl, the water cold and tasting faintly of the peat and the rock it had passed through. The simple act of drinking, of feeling the cold liquid move down into your chest, was a quiet pleasure that needed no comment. The fire had burned low while you were outside, and you added 2 fresh blocks of peat, placing them carefully on the bed of embers so that they would catch and burn slowly. The peat, cut from the bank on the high moor, was dark and dense, its surface marked with the parallel grooves of the cutting iron, and as it heated, it released a smell that was the essence of the moorland, earthy, slightly sweet, and deeply familiar. The flames crept up around the new blocks, small tongues of orange and blue that licked at the peat, and then steadied into a quiet, glowing combustion that would last for hours. You took a piece of oat cake from the small crock that stood on the stone shelf, breaking off a portion with your fingers. The oat cake was hard and dry, made from oats grown in the last harvest before the fields were left fallow, ground in the stone quern that still sat by the door of the nearest empty cottage, and baked on a girdle over the fire. Its flavor was mild and nutty, and you ate it slowly, chewing each bite many times. Alongside the oat cake, you ate a sliver of hard cheese made from the milk of the goats that had once been kept in the pen behind, the bothy, a cheese that was crumbly and sharp and coated in a thin layer of wax. The meal was small and plain, enough to ease the hollow feeling in your stomach without making you heavy or sleepy, and you washed it down with another cup of the cold spring water. Through the open door, the valley continued its silent afternoon. The shadows of the clouds moved across the hills in slow procession, darkening the heather and then releasing it back into light. A breeze stirred the grass near the threshold, making it bend and whisper, and then the breeze died and the grass stood still. The curlew called again, further away now, and a pair of ravens crossed the sky high up, their flight a slow, deliberate circling that took them over the ridge and out of sight. Nothing hurried, nothing demanded attention. The world moved at the pace of the clouds and the seasons. After a while you returned to the loom, sitting down on the bench that had grown warm from your earlier presence. The warp threads waited in their patient lines, the shuttle rested where you had left it, and the half-finished tartan on the cloth beam showed the clean, bright pattern of the set. You ran a hand over the woven surface, feeling its firmness and its slight woolly texture, the tiny ridges where the weft passed over the warp. The plaid was a little longer than it had been at dawn, its length increased by the quiet work of the morning, and the afternoon stretched ahead with more hours of the same gentle rhythm. You paused before picking up the shuttle, letting the stillness of the bothy and the valley settle around you once more. The light through the door had moved another inch across the floor, the fire was burning steadily, and the kettle was beginning to hum with the first sign of steam. Everything was in its place. The world reduced to this small room and the work that lived within it. And there was no need to hurry back to the weaving, because the cloth was patient, the loom was ready, and the day would hold whatever rhythm you chose to give it. The light that had been a pale gold at the door began to soften and withdraw as the afternoon wore on, the square of brightness on the earthen floor shrinking inch by inch until it was only a narrow strip at the threshold, and then that too faded into a cool, even grey. The window, small and deep set in the stone wall, showed a sky that was shifting from silver to a darker slate, the clouds thickening as the day moved toward its close. Inside the bothy, the shadows that had been kept at bay in the corners now stretched out across the floor, reaching toward the loom, like slow dark water rising. The colours of the tartan, so clear in the daylight, began to mute and blend together, the green and brown and blue losing their distinct edges and merging into a soft, indistinguishable darkness. You noticed this gradual dimming, not as a loss but as a gentle change in the texture of the room, a deepening of the quiet that made the small space feel even more enclosed and protected. The fire had burned down to a steady, glowing bed of red embers that cast a warm, flickering glow across the hearthstone and the nearby wall, but its light did not reach the loom. For a while longer, you continued to weave by touch and memory, your hands finding the shuttle in the dark, your feet pressing the treadles in the same slow rhythm they had followed all day. The motions were so deeply learned that your fingers could judge the tension of the weft, the position of the selvdige, and the gentle thump of the batten without needing to see. The shuttle passed through the shed and returned, and the cloth grew, even in the darkness, each thread added in its proper place by the habit of muscles that did not forget. Eventually, when the darkness had deepened enough that even the counting in your head felt less certain, you set the shuttle down and rose from the bench to light the cruisy lamp. The lamp stood on the stone shelf beside the Bible, a simple vessel of hammered iron with a shallow bowl that held fish oil and a wick of twisted flax laid along a narrow spout. The oil was pale and thin, brought from the coast by the packman who carried it in a stoneware jar, stoppered with cork, and it smelled of the sea, a faint, briny scent that mingled with the peat smoke and the wool. You used a splint of dry heather to carry a flame from the hearth to the lamp, touching it to the wick, and the oil caught with a small yellow flame that fluttered once and then steadied. The light was not bright. It was a soft, trembling glow that illuminated a circle perhaps 2 feet across, just enough to show the immediate area of the loom, while leaving the rest of the bothy in deep, layered shadow. You carried the lamp to the loom, setting it on a flat stone that rested on the warp beam, where its light would fall directly on the shed and the fell of the cloth. The flame made a tiny reflection in each of the brass eyelets of the heddles, 100 small points of gold that glistened and vanished as the harnesses rose and fell with the treadles, a constellation of sparks that moved in time with the weaving. The smoke from the lamp, a thin, pale ribbon, rose straight up until it met the peat smoke and joined it, the 2 streams mingling in the rafters and adding their combined scent to the old, dark patina of the thatch. The atmosphere in the bothy grew warmer and closer, with the lamp lit, the small room now sealed against the night beyond its walls. You sat down on the bench again, the wood creaking softly under your weight, and picked up the shuttle. The rhythm resumed, though slightly slower now, the passes of the weft taking a fraction longer because your eyes had to confirm what your fingers already knew. The shuttle moved from right hand to left. The beater swung forward with its soft thud. The treadles creaked, and the lamp flame wavered in the draught of the motion before steadying again. The sound of the loom seemed louder in the darkness, each click and thump more distinct against the deep silence that had settled over the valley with the coming of night. The beat of the batten was a gentle, regular pulse, like the heartbeat of the bothy itself, and the whisper of the shuttle was a long, hushed breath that repeated without end. Outside, the last birds had settled into the heather, their quiet complete. A fox barked once on the hill, a single sharp call that carried through the still air and then faded, leaving no echo. The wind had dropped with the dusk, and the burn's murmur seemed softer now, muffled by the cooler, denser air that pooled in the glen. The only sounds that remained were the ones inside the bothy, the crackle of the peat, the the hiss of the lamp, and the steady, hypnotic rhythm of the loom. These sounds folded together into a single, continuous presence, a quiet music that asked for nothing and offered a deep, slow comfort. The weaving continued, and the pattern of the tartan emerged from the dimness in small, incremental stages. The lamp's glow caught the edge of each new brown stripe as it appeared, highlighting the difference between the dark russet of the crotal dye and the deeper shadow of the green. The single blue thread, when it came, shimmered for a moment in the lamplight, a pale flash that looked almost silver against the darker wool. You watched these small appearances with a calm, steady attention, your eyes moving from the selvage to the fell and back again, checking that each thread sat properly against its neighbor. The cloth being turned with its slow, ratcheted click, and the woven length of the plaids grew longer, its colors now hidden in the gloom except for the few inches that the lamp revealed. Time, in the lamplight, lost its usual markers. You did not know how long you had been weaving, and you did not need to know. The count of the set repeated, and the shuttle passed, and the fire settled lower in the hearth. At some point, you paused to add more oil to the lamp, tilting the stoneware jar carefully so that the oil ran in a thin stream into the iron bowl, the level rising slowly until the wick was fed again. At another point, you added peat to the fire, the fresh blocks hissing as they touched the embers and then catching with a soft whoomph of flame that sent shadows leaping across the walls. Then you returned to the bench, and the rhythm resumed, the shuttle sliding back and forth, the batten thumping, the treadles creaking in their patient round. The night was long, but the weaving made it pass without any awareness of its length. Each pick of the weft was a small, complete act that held no burden, no urgency, no thought of what came next. The cloth grew, and the lamp burned, and the silence of the valley wrapped around the bothy like a thick, soft blanket. You were not tired, not restless, you were simply present, your hands moving in their ancient pattern, your mind quiet and still. The bothy held you in its warm, smoky shelter, and the world outside, with its empty crofts and its waiting ships, was as distant as the stars that were hidden behind the clouds. The shuttle moved back and forth in the steady, unhurried rhythm that the night had settled into, your hands finding their way by the small golden circle of the lamp's glow, and by the deeper knowledge that lived in your fingers. The sound of the loom, the click of the treadles, and the soft thud of the batten had become so much a part of the silence that it no longer seemed like a separate thing, but like the silence itself, given a gentle pulse. As the weaving continued, your mind drifted away from the present moment, not into sleep, but into a calm, waking reverie where memories surfaced quietly, one after another, like the slow rising of bubbles in the deep pool of the spring. These memories were not sharp or demanding. They were soft and worn at the edges, appearing without effort and fading back without resistance, woven into the cloth, along with the green and brown and blue threads. You remembered the sound of the Sunday psalm singing that used to rise from the meeting house down by the crossing of the burn, a low, unaccompanied line of melody carried across the heather on the still air of a Sabbath morning. The meeting house had been a plain, whitewashed building with a heather thatch roof and no steeple, just a simple stone box where the families of the glen gathered in their plaids and their clean caps. The singing was led by the precentor, who would chant each line alone in a high, wavering voice before the congregation joined in, their voices blending into a slow, mournful, beautiful sound that seemed to belong to the hills as much as the curlew's call. You remembered standing beside your family in the hard wooden pew, feeling the vibration of the singing through the floorboards, and watching the light from the unglazed windows fall across the bowed heads of the neighbors. Those neighbors had names and faces that you still recalled clearly. The old man who always wore a blue bonnet and sat by the door, the young mother with the twin boys who could not stop whispering, the tall shepherd who sang the loudest and always a little behind the beat. They had all gone now, to Nova Scotia or to the mills of Paisley, but their voices lingered in the memory of the psalms, a silent harmony that you could almost hear when the shuttle paused between passes. Another memory rose gently into your thoughts, the memory of the autumn gathering of the sheep from the high sheilings. Each summer, the ewes and lambs were driven up to the high pastures where the grass was sweet and the wind kept the flies away, and the young people of the glen would stay with them in the little stone sheiling huts, making butter and cheese and singing the long evenings away. In the early autumn, when the first frost silvered the heather, everyone would walk up to bring the flocks down. A slow procession of people and dogs and bleating sheep that wound down the stony paths in the golden light. You remembered the sound of it, the barking of the collies, the high, anxious calls of the lambs, the low, reassuring bars of the ewes, and the laughter of the children who ran alongside the flock with sticks of hazel. The sheep would pour down the hillside like a slow white river, parting around the rocks and joining again, and the people would follow behind with their plaids wrapped against the coming chill. That gathering had been one of the last before the clearances began, and though you did not dwell on that fact, the memory carried a particular softness, a sense of something complete that had passed into the quiet of the hills. You thought back to the winter evenings when the bothy had been full of voices, when neighbours would walk up the path with their spinning or their mending and sit around the fire, sharing the warmth and the light. The women would card wool and spin, their wheels humming together in a chorus of different pitches, while the men would repair tools or carve new spoons from birchwood, the shavings curling onto the floor and catching the firelight. Stories were told, old tales of the fairies who lived in the green hills and the water horses who haunted the deep lochs, and the children would listen with wide eyes, pressing closer to their mothers. Sometimes a fiddle appeared, carried carefully in a woolen cloth, and a tune would start, a slow strathspey or a lilting reel, and feet would tap on the earthen floor. You remembered the smell of those evenings, the peat smoke and the wool and the earthy scent of wet plaids drying by the fire, and the way the shadows danced on the stone walls. Now the bothy held only one voice, the voice of the loom, and the stories were folded into the cloth rather than spoken aloud. You remembered teaching a younger sibling to card wool by this very fire, the child's small hands clumsy with the wooden paddles, dropping them more than once onto the floor, until the wire teeth were full of dust and had to be picked clean. The child's face, frowning with concentration, was lit by the flames, and you had shown her again and again how to draw the carders gently, how to roll the wool from the teeth into a soft, airy log. After many attempts, she had produced a lumpy, uneven little roll, and she had held it up to you with a look of quiet pride that needed no words. You had taken it and spun it into a short length of yarn, showing her how her wool became thread, and she had watched the spinning wheel with a new kind of understanding. That sister was gone now, across the ocean with her own family, and the spinning wheel in the corner was silent, but the memory of that small triumphant rolag had worked its way into the yarn you were weaving now, a single thread of recollection among many. The melting floor down by the river came to mind, the long, low building where the barley was spread to germinate before being dried in the kiln. The floor had smelled sweet and earthy, a warm, living scent that filled your nose and stayed on your clothes. You remembered walking there with your father on a damp autumn day, the barley grains pale and swollen underfoot, and the maltster turning the grain with a wide wooden shovel in a slow, endless rhythm. The whisky that came from that malt was made in a small still hidden in the rocks above the burn, and it was shared out at hogmanay and at weddings. A clear, fiery spirit that tasted of the peat and the water of the glen. The melting floor had fallen silent now. Its roof collapsed, its barley long since scattered, but the memory of its sweet smell returned to you as you wove, bringing with it the face of the old maltster who had always given you a handful of the sweet, sticky grain to chew. You recalled the taste of cloudberries gathered in the high bog, a small golden fruit that grew among the sphagnum moss on the shoulder of the hill. The berries were rare and precious, and you had to walk far to find them, your feet sinking into the wet, springy ground, your hands reaching carefully among the reddened leaves to pick the soft, ripe globes. Each berry was like a tiny burst of honey and tartness on the tongue, a fleeting sweetness that belonged to the high, wild places. You had carried a small basket of them home, and they had been eaten fresh with a little cream from the goat, a rare treat that the whole family shared. The memory of that taste rose now in the quiet of the weaving, as vivid as if the berries were still on your tongue, and it mingled with the scent of the wool and the peat to create a moment of tranquil, wordless pleasure. These memories floated by like leaves on a slow stream, unattached to any urgent feeling, simply present in the half-light of the lamp-lit bothy. The loom kept its rhythm underneath them, anchoring the past to the present with each precise crossing of warp and weft. The memories were not a distraction from the weaving, they were a part of it, the invisible threads that ran alongside the wool and gave the cloth a significance that went beyond its practical use. When the plaid was finished and worn, it would carry all of this with it: the singing and the sheep, the fiddles and the cloudberries, the child's first rolag and the old maltster's smile, all folded silently into the green and brown and blue. The lamp burned on, its flame steady and small, and the weaving continued, your hands never stopping their gentle, repeated motions. The night outside was deep and dark, the valley silent under its blanket of cloud, but inside the bothy, the past and the present were woven together into a single, continuous fabric, a cloth of time that grew longer with each pass of the shuttle. The cloth beam was nearly full, its dark wooden roller now wrapped thick with the woven tartan, and you could feel the difference in the weight of the fabric as it turned with each ratchet click, heavier and more substantial than it had been when the first few inches were wound around it in the early morning of another day. The warp threads, which had stretched in their hundreds from the back beam to the front, were now shortened to their final length, the last yard of their span passing through the heddles and the reed. You could see the end of the warp approaching, the place where the threads were tied in bunches to the apron rod on the warp beam, and you knew that soon the weaving would reach its natural conclusion. There was no sadness in this knowledge, no hurry to finish. There was only the same steady, patient rhythm that had carried the work from the beginning, a rhythm that would continue until there were no more threads to cross. The pattern of the tartan was fully formed across the width of the plaid, the broad green fields and the narrow brown pears and the single pale blue lines repeating in their perfect symmetry, each repeat identical to the one before and the one after. You paused now and then to run your thumb over the woven surface, feeling its density and its evenness, the way the weft threads had packed against each other, to create a fabric that was firm yet supple, warm yet light enough to drape around the body. The texture was slightly raised where the colors crossed, a subtle grid that you could feel more than see, and the selves were straight and true, the small stone weight still hanging from the left edge, still swinging gently with each pass of the shuttle. Everything was as it should be, the work of many hours gathered into a single, continuous piece of cloth that would soon be cut free from the loom. The final few inches required the same care as the first. You slowed down slightly as the end of the warp approached, ensuring that the tension remained even and that the selvage edge did not pull inward now that the warp threads were shorter and less elastic. The warp, which had stretched and relaxed many times over the course of the weaving, now had a different feel under your fingers, a little tighter, a little less forgiving, and you adjusted your touch accordingly, pulling the weft with a slightly gentler hand so that the cloth would not pucker. The peat fire had been replenished and burned with a calm, steady flame, and the morning light, pale and grey through the small window, fell across the loom in a soft wash that made the colours of the tartan glow quietly. The cruisy lamp had been extinguished hours ago, its fishy scent still lingering in the air, mixing with the wool and the smoke and the cool, fresh draught from under the door. The last repeat of the set began without ceremony, the same sequence of 60 green, 2 brown, 2 green, 1 blue, 2 green, 2 brown that had begun the cloth many yards ago. You counted the threads in your head as you had done 1,000 times, the numbers rising and falling like a familiar melody, and the shuttle passed through each shed with the same oiled, whisper-quiet motion. The weave was a plain tabby, a simple over-under crossing that had proved itself over centuries, and the batten thumped home each weft thread with a gentle finality that seemed to mark the last inches differently, though the sound was no louder or softer than it had ever been. The blue stripe appeared, the single pale thread shining for a moment before it was pressed into place, and then the green resumed, and then the final brown stripe marked the border of the last complete repeat. When the last pass of the shuttle came, it was a weft of deep heather green, the same color that had begun the entire cloth. You sent the shuttle through the shed one final time, catching it in your left hand, and you drew it out and set it down on the beam. The beater swung forward with its soft, pendulous thud, pressing the last weft thread against the fell, and then it swung back and rested. The treadles were still. The heddles hung motionless. The warp threads, no longer crossed, lay flat and parallel in their final configuration. The loom was silent, Its rhythm finally paused after so many hours, and the quiet that followed was deep and full, a stillness that seemed to spread outward from the bothy into the waiting valley. You sat for a moment on the bench, your hands resting lightly on the wooden frame, feeling the warmth of the work still tingling in your fingers. The plaid was complete, woven from end to end, its pattern whole and its fabric sound. You leaned forward and examined the last few inches, checking that the weft was beaten in tightly and that no loose threads marred the surface. Then you took a small needle made of bone from the shelf, threaded it with the tail of the green weft yarn, and carefully tucked the end back into the cloth, weaving the thread through several picks of the fabric so that it would not unravel. The needle moved in and out with tiny, precise stitches, disappearing the end into the body of the plaid until it was invisible. You did the same with the beginning tail at the other end of the cloth, working your way back through the first few picks until that end too was secured. With the ends tucked, you stood up and walked around to the back of the loom where the warp beam held the remaining yard of unwoven threads. They hung in neat bunches from the apron rod, each bunch tied with a simple knot that you now began to undo, one by one, working your way from left to right. The threads, released from their tension, sprang slightly and then hung loose, and you gathered them in your hand, feeling their softness and the faint, oily residue of the wool. At the front of the loom, you untied the finished cloth from the cloth beam, loosening the cords that held the apron rod in place, and then you carefully lifted the entire length of the plaid away from the loom, feeling its full weight for the first time. The plaid was heavy and soft in your arms, its folds draping over your hands and down toward the floor, the colors rich and deep even in the grey light. You carried it to the bench and laid it out flat, running your palm over its entire length, feeling the smooth, even surface and the warmth that the wool held from the fire and from the work itself. The fabric measured many yards, enough to wrap around a body several times, to pleat and belt, to pull up over the head against the wind. Its colors, the green and brown and blue, shimmered faintly in the shifting light, and the pattern of the set repeated from end to end without a single mistake or irregularity. It was a piece of cloth that any weaver would recognize as good work, honest work, the kind of work that needed no praise because the cloth itself was the proof. You folded the plaid in the traditional manner, pleating it loosely from one end so that it could be worn over the shoulder or wrapped around the body without further arrangement. The folds fell naturally along the lines of the set, the pattern matching up at the edges as if the cloth had been designed for this exact motion. When it was fully pleated, you laid it across the loom bench, a long, neat bundle of wool that held the warmth of the bothy and the memory of the sheep and the scent of the dyes. The loom stood empty behind it, the heddles silent, the shuttle resting on the beam, the warping mill in the corner holding spare yarn for work that might or might not come. There was no hurry to decide what came next, no pressure to warp the loom again immediately. The loom had done its work, and it could rest. You stood for a while, looking at the plaid and the loom and the quiet bothy around you, the fire glowing softly in the hearth, the window showing the grey sky and the distant hills, the door slightly ajar to let in the clean, cold air. The valley beyond was still and silent, its empty crofts hidden in the folds of the land, and the burn continued its endless trickle down the slope, unseen but always heard. The day stretched ahead without demands, a calm space between the completion of one task and the beginning of whatever would follow, and you filled that space with the simple, quiet awareness of a thing finished, a work that had taken many hours and many seasons and was now, at last, complete. The morning came in no different from the one that had begun the weaving, the first grey light seeping through the small window and the gap under the door, the air cold and still, carrying the familiar sense of damp wool and old peat smoke and the clean, earthy breath of the hill. You woke on the bench where you had slept, the finished plaid folded beneath your head, and for a long moment you did not move, letting the stillness of the bothy hold you in its soft, dark embrace. The fire had burned down to a bed of pale ash, with a few embers still glowing at its heart, and the iron kettle hung motionless from its chain, a single drop of water clinging to its spout and catching the faint light. Everything was as it had always been, the loom standing silent in the center of the room, the heddles motionless, the shuttle resting where you had left it, and yet the quality of the quiet felt different now, a little deeper, a little more complete, as if the bothy itself understood that this morning was the last. You rose slowly, your bare feet finding the packed earth of the floor, and you crossed to the hearth to coax the embers back to life, adding a pinch of dry bracken and blowing gently until a small flame licked up and caught the new peat you placed upon it. The smoke rose in its familiar ribbon, curling toward the thatch, and the warmth began to spread outward into the room, touching the stones and the wood and your cold cheeks. You filled the kettle from the wooden pail, set it over the flame, and then stood by the door, looking out through the gap at the valley that had been your home for as long as memory reached. The valley was even emptier now than it had been the day before, the last of the families having left while you wove, their departure marked only by the fresh patches of bare earth where their belongings had been dragged to the waiting carts. Those patches of raw brown soil stood out against the grey-green of the grass, small scars that would heal over by the next season, and the cottages beyond them were dark and roofless, their doorways open to the wind. The sight was a quiet fact, not a wound. You observed it as you observed the clouds gathering over the western ridge, or the way the burn had shifted its course slightly over the winter, with a calm, accepting attention that asked for nothing else. You turned back into the bothy and took the finished tartan plaid from the bench, shaking out its folds so that its full length hung from your hands, the green and brown and blue shimmering in the firelight. You racked it around your shoulders in the old way, pleating it at the waist and belting it with a simple leather strap, the wool settling against your body with a warmth that was immediate and deep. The plaid covered you from shoulder to knee, its weight a comfort, its scent the scent of home, and you knew that it would shield you from the wind on the long walk to the coast. You moved through the bothy then, gathering the few things that mattered and could be carried. The wooden bowl carved from birch went into a canvas bag, its inside still smelling faintly of the morning's water. The horn spoon, smooth and golden, was tucked beside it, and the small flat stone that had served as a self-dish weight, worn to a perfect oval by the burn and by your fingers, was slipped into a pocket of the plaid. You also took a handful of raw fleece from the basket in the corner, the last of the shearing, a soft, greasy token of the sheep you had known, and you wrapped it in a scrap of linen before placing it in the bag. The Bible with the cracked leather cover you left on the stone shelf. It belonged to the bothy, and its pages held the air of this place too deeply to be taken elsewhere. The dried heather over the door you touched once, gently, before leaving it where it hung. The loom stood in the center of the room, its wooden frame dark and solid, its heddles still threaded with the remnants of the warp that had not been used. You ran your hand over the warp beam one last time, feeling the smooth, warm wood and the faint ridges where the threads had been wound. A silent thanks for all the hours of quiet rhythm it had given you. The shuttle still holding its green quill, you placed on the bench where the next weaver, if one ever came, would find it. The spinning wheel in the corner you left as well, its drive band slack, its treadle still, its work complete for now. You did not dismantle the loom or pack its parts. It was too large, too heavy, too much a part of the bothy's own body to be moved. It would remain here, standing against the weather, until the thatch gave way and the walls crumbled, a skeleton of the old life in the glen. The fire you tended one last time, adding 2 fresh blocks of peat and arranging them so that they would burn slowly and hold the warmth long after you were gone. The flame caught and steadied, and you left the door slightly ajar so that the smoke could escape, and so that anyone passing through this emptied land, a shepherd or a traveller or a fox, would find a trace of heat and the lingering scent of habitation. The bothy would not be cold for many hours yet, and the small gesture felt right. A quiet closing of the circle that had begun when the first stones were laid and the first fire lit in this spot. You stepped outside, the plaid wrapped close, the canvas bag over your shoulder, and you paused to look back at the bothy. Its turf roof was green with new grass, its stone walls the colour of the hill behind it, and already it was beginning to merge back into the landscape, just another shape among the rocks and the heather. The path down to the coast was a pale thread winding through the glen, visible in the grey morning light, and you set your feet upon it, walking slowly, your pace unhurried. The ground was soft underfoot, a mixture of grass and moss and the small hard stems of last year's heather, and the slope descended gently, carrying you past the empty crofts and the overgrown rundrigs and the stone enclosures where the kale had grown. You did not look away from these places. You let your gaze rest on them as you passed, acknowledging the walls that had sheltered families and the fields that had fed them, all of them now returning to the wild in a slow, peaceful reclamation. The burn kept you company on the walk, its voice a constant murmur on your left, sometimes loud where it fell over a ledge of rock, sometimes soft where it pooled in a peaty hollow. A dipper, small and dark with a white breast, bobbed on a stone midstream, its movements quick and mechanical, and then it flew upstream with a whirring of wings that was the only sound apart from the water and the wind. The curlew called once from the high moor, and then silence closed back over the valley, a wide open stillness that seemed to stretch from the hilltops to the sea. The emptiness no longer felt like loss, it felt like space, like a deep breath drawn and held, and you walked through it as a swimmer moves through calm water with slow, deliberate strokes. The path descended into a shallow pass between two hills, the ground growing rockier and the heather giving way to coarse grass and patches of bare scree. The view ahead opened to reveal the sea loch far below, a long, narrow arm of salt water that glittered dully under the grey sky, its surface ruffled by a gentle wind that you could not yet feel. A small ship waited at anchor near the shore, its sails furled, its masts bare, a vessel bound for the new lands across the western ocean, and a few figures moved on the deck, tiny and distant. A boat was drawn up on the shingle, waiting to take the last passengers aboard, and a cluster of people stood by the water's edge, their belongings piled around them, their voices too far away to be heard. You did not hurry toward them. The ship would not sail until the tide turned, and the tide answered to no one's haste. The path wound down the final slope, crossing a narrow bridge of stones laid over a small burn that fed the loch, and then it flattened out onto the coastal grass, the ground becoming sandy and scattered with shells. The air changed here, the scent of the peat and heather giving way to the salt and the seaweed, a cold, clean, briny smell that filled your lungs and stung your nostrils. Gulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp and white against the grey sky, and the shingle crunched under your feet as you approached the waiting boat. The Tartan Plaid kept the chill at bay, its weight a steady presence on your shoulders, and as you walked, your hand brushed the stone Selvagist weight in your pocket, a small, smooth reminder of the loom and the bothy and the hundreds of thousands of passers that had woven the cloth around you. You did not look back as you reached the shore, not because you wished to forget, but because the valley was already within you, carried in the pattern of the plaid and the scent of the wool and the quiet memories that would surface, unbidden, for the rest of your days. You knew the shape of every hill, the sound of the burn in every season, the way the light fell through the small window at dawn, and these things would not be left behind no matter how far the ship carried you. The boat scraped against the shingle as you helped push it into the water, the cold sea washing over your bare feet, and then you climbed aboard with the others. Sitting in the stern with the plaid pulled close, the oars dipped into the grey water with a soft, rhythmic splash, and the shore began to recede, the bothy on the hillside growing smaller and smaller until it was indistinguishable from the stones around it. The ship loomed above you, its wooden hull dark and wet, and ropes were thrown down to make the boat fast. You climbed the ladder slowly, the rungs cold and slippery under your hands, and when you reached the deck, you found a place by the rail, where you could watch the land for a while longer. The anchor was raised, the sails unfurled with a great rustling of canvas, and the ship began to move, sliding through the grey water with a gentle rocking motion that was not unlike the rhythm of the loom. The valley faded slowly into the mist and the distance, the hills becoming blue-grey shapes that merged with the clouds, and then only the sea and the sky remained, vast and quiet and full of a different kind of stillness. You rested your hand on the plaid, feeling its warmth, and the ship sailed on into the calm, open water, carrying you toward a new shore under the same grey sky that had watched over the bothy and the loom and the last, completed cloth.